Ever feel like you're spinning your wheels in your career? Like no matter how hard you try, something's holding you back.
Oh, absolutely. That feeling of being stuck is something I think a lot of people can relate to, especially in the middle of their careers.
It's easy to point fingers at external factors, the economy, lack of opportunities, whatever.
Right. It's always easier to blame something outside of ourselves.
But what if the biggest obstacles are actually internal? Roadblocks we're unknowingly creating for ourselves.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. And honestly, probably a lot more accurate than we'd like to admit.
We're going to deep dive into that very idea in this FBS podcast, Deep Dive, as part of our mission to help you discover your full potential and really thrive in your career.
I love that because, let's be real, sometimes the toughest battles we face are the ones within ourselves.
And to kick things off, I want to share a really thought-provoking discussion that recently took place at the Forest Business School, or FBS for short.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What were they discussing?
Well, it was a diverse group of forestry professionals. We had a sawmill owner, some loggers, foresters, you name it. And they were all grappling with this idea of internal roadblocks, inspired by a quote that really breaks it down.
A quote. Do tell.
It goes like this: lack of clarity is a lack of honesty. Lack of talent is a lack of patience. Lack of agency is a lack of courage. Lack of growth is a lack of self-respect. Lack of opportunity is a lack of curiosity. Lack of progress is a lack of self-discipline. Lack of success is a lack of long-term vision.
Wow, okay, that's a lot to unpack, but I can already see how each of those connections could be a real game changer if we actually take them to heart.
Exactly. And the way each person in that FBS group connected these ideas to their own experiences was fascinating. Like, take the sawmill owner. He was talking about how he struggles with honesty, but not in the way you might think.
Okay, how so?
He admitted that he often avoids confrontation to keep things running smoothly, even if it means letting others dictate situations.
That's interesting. Especially coming from someone who had the courage to start their own sawmill. Clearly, he's not lacking in that department.
Exactly. So it made everyone wonder, where is that lack of honesty really showing up?
Maybe it's about being honest with himself, about what he really wants and needs. Or maybe it's about being honest with others, even if it risks ruffling some feathers.
That's a great point. It might not always be about being intentionally dishonest, but maybe about not being fully truthful with ourselves about our own motivations or needs. And that can definitely lead to a lack of clarity in our decision-making.
Totally. And that whole honesty piece also came up when the veteran logger in the group talked about feeling pressured to give away services or undervalue his work.
Right. Like sometimes clients expect extra work without additional compensation, which honestly puts these folks in a tough spot.
Yeah, it's like they're constantly walking this tightrope between maintaining strong relationships and protecting their own business interests.
It really highlights that sometimes a lack of honesty, whether it's with ourselves or with others, can create these tricky dynamics where we end up feeling undervalued or taken advantage of.
Absolutely. And recognizing that pattern, understanding that it might stem from not being fully honest about your worth, that can be a huge first step towards setting those necessary boundaries.
Totally. Boundaries are key.
Hmm.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about talent, or rather, the idea that what we often perceive as a lack of talent might actually be a lack of patience in disguise.
I love that because I think we often put people on these pedestals, like they were
Mhm.
just born with this magical ability. But the reality is, talent is often developed through hard work, dedication, and yes, a whole lot of patience.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the FBS group actually had a perfect example of this. They were talking about this young logger who's building his own forwarder from scratch.
Wow. Now that takes some serious dedication, not to mention patience.
Right. He was talking about all these setbacks he's faced,
Mm,
mechanical issues, sourcing parts, the whole 9 yards.
yeah.
But he just keeps plugging away at it.
And that's what sets him apart. It's not necessarily that he has some innate talent for mechanics, but that he has the patience and perseverance to stick with it even when things get tough.
It reminds me of something I've observed over the years, actually.
Oh, I'd love to hear this. What have you observed?
Well, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of talented piano students. And the ones who really excel, the ones who truly master their craft, it's not just because they have a natural aptitude for music.
It's because they put in the hours, day after day, year after year.
Exactly. They embrace the process, the challenges, the frustrations. They understand that true mastery takes time.
And I think that's a powerful lesson for all of us, regardless of our field. Maybe we're giving up on things too soon because we don't see immediate results.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, especially in today's world of instant gratification.
Right. We want everything now, now, now. But some things, the really worthwhile things, they take time, they take patience, they take that willingness to embrace the messy, sometimes frustrating process of learning and growing. Preach. So, what was next on the FBS agenda?
Well, then they moved on to the idea of a lack of agency being tied to a lack of courage.
Ooh, interesting. What do they have to say about that?
Well, guess who brought this up?
The sawmill owner.
Bingo. He was talking about how he tends to let others take the lead, especially in situations where there might be conflict.
You mean like the honesty thing we were talking about earlier?
Exactly. And he even had this really insightful analogy to explain it.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He compared it to selling a car with hidden problems.
Oh, I see where this is going. You might make a quick sale by not being upfront, but it'll probably come back to bite you later.
Exactly. You risk damaging your reputation, losing trust, all that. And he was saying how that same principle applies to any decision we make, whether it's in business or in our personal lives.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. So, is he saying that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to be upfront and honest, even if it means having a difficult conversation?
I think so. It's about having the courage to face those tough situations head on instead of sweeping them under the rug or hoping they'll just magically disappear.
And that takes us right into the next connection. Lack of growth being linked to a lack of self-respect. Because you have to value yourself, your time, your energy enough to actually prioritize your own growth and development.
You know, the consulting forester in the group had a really insightful perspective on this. He was talking about how he often struggles to say no, even when he's completely overwhelmed.
Oh, I know that feeling. It's like you want to help everyone and be everything to everybody.
Exactly. And he admitted that it was actually hindering his own growth. He was so busy putting everyone else's needs first that he wasn't making time for his own development.
Which is, ironic because if he wants to truly be helpful to others, he needs to be the best version of himself. And that takes time and energy.
Right. It's not selfish to prioritize your own growth. In fact, it's actually the opposite. It's about making sure you're taking care of yourself so you can show up fully for the people and projects that matter most.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. If you're constantly depleting yourself, you're not going to have anything left to give.
Okay, before we get too deep into self-care, let's move on to the next connection. Lack of opportunity might actually be a lack of curiosity.
Ooh, okay, tell me more about this one.
The FBS group was sharing a story about a forester who was feeling really stuck in her job. She was doing a lot of data analysis, and she just felt like she wasn't learning or growing anymore.
Sounds like she hit a bit of a plateau.
Exactly. But then she realized that maybe the problem wasn't the job itself, but her approach to it.
Meaning?
Maybe she hadn't fully explored all the possibilities. Maybe there was a different way to analyze the data, or a new tool she could learn, or an expert she could consult with. But she was so stuck in her own head, so focused on what wasn't working, that she wasn't even open to exploring other options.
It's like she was letting her own lack of curiosity limit her opportunities.
Exactly. And that's when the veteran logger chimed in with a really interesting point. He was saying how he often gets his best ideas when he's not even thinking about work.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. Sometimes you just need to step away from the problem and let your mind wander a bit.
Right. He said he'll go for a walk in the woods or tinker around in his workshop, and that's when the solutions just seem to pop into his head.
It's amazing how that works, isn't it? Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop trying so hard and just let your subconscious do the work.
I totally agree. And on that note, I think we need to take our own advice and step away for a moment.
Yes, let's pause and give our listeners a chance to digest all this goodness. We'll be back in a jiffy to continue this deep dive into overcoming those sneaky internal roadblocks.
We'll pick up right where we left off, exploring those final connections and discussing how we can put these insights into action. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Ready to keep exploring these internal roadblocks?
Absolutely, I'm hooked. That last segment was eye-opening. It really made me think about how I might be self-sabotaging without even realizing it.
I think that's the power of these conversations, right? They challenge us to look inward and question those ingrained patterns and beliefs that might be holding us back.
So true. So where were we? Yes. The idea that lack of progress can stem from a lack of self-discipline.
And this was a big one for the consulting forester in the FBS group. He was juggling a million projects, feeling completely overwhelmed. Sound familiar?
Oh yeah, been there.
Yeah.
But what was his takeaway? How did he connect that lack of progress to self-discipline?
Well, he realized that he was letting distractions get the best of him, lack of focus, poor time management, all those things that can really derail your productivity.
Right, it's like you can have all the opportunities in the world, but if you're not organized and disciplined, you're not going to get very far.
Exactly. And for him, a big part of it was learning to say no, which, if you remember, ties back to that whole self-respect thing we were talking about earlier.
Oh, totally. Saying no can be tough, especially when you're a people pleaser like that consulting forester.
Right. But he was realizing that by saying yes to everything, he was actually spreading himself too thin and not doing his best work on any of his projects.
It's like that saying, jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly. Sometimes we need to be more selective, more focused in order to truly excel. Okay, ready to tackle the final connection from the FBS discussion.
Hit me with it.
Lack of success equals a lack of long-term vision.
Ooh, that's a good one. And I bet they use the sawmill owner's experience as an example.
You know it. Remember how he had this clear vision for his business right from the start? He wasn't just in it for the quick buck. He was building something sustainable.
Something he could eventually step away from and know that it would continue to thrive.
Exactly. And that long-term vision, it guided all his decisions along the way. It helped him stay focused on what truly mattered, even when faced with the challenges or setbacks.
And what's interesting is that his vision actually evolved over time. Like initially he started the sawmill as a way to create a more stable outlet for his logging business. He wanted more control over his markets,
Yeah, makes sense.
But then as the sawmill grew, his vision expanded. He started thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave, the impact he wanted to have on his family and community. And that shift in perspective led him to make some pretty big changes in his role within the business.
Like moving from a hands-on operator to more of a manager. That's a huge transition.
It is. But it was all driven by that long-term vision.
Which I think is a great reminder for all of us. Having a long-term vision isn't about creating this rigid, unchangeable plan. It's about having a guiding star, a sense of direction that helps you make decisions as you navigate the ups and downs of your career.
And sometimes that means being willing to adapt, to pivot, to evolve as your circumstances change.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Like, remember that veteran logger we were talking about earlier? The one who was wrestling with whether to take on that really challenging job.
Yeah, he was torn between the potential financial rewards and the potential impact on his time and energy.
That's a classic dilemma. But it's in those moments, when faced with a tough choice, that having a long-term vision can be incredibly helpful.
It helps you weigh the pros and cons, not just in the short term, but in the context of your larger goals and aspirations. Okay, deep breaths, everyone, because we've covered a lot of ground in this segment.
And before we move on to the final part of this deep dive, I think it's important to just sit with these ideas for a moment. Which of these connections really resonates with you? What area of your own life might need a little more honesty, patience, courage, or self-respect?
Those are great questions to ponder. We'll be back in a flash to wrap up this episode and explore how we can start putting these insights into action. Okay, so after that little reflection break, I think the connection that's really sticking with me is the one between lack of success and lack of long-term vision.
Yeah, that one seems to hit home for a lot of people. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think in our industry, it's easy to get so caught up in the day-to-day grind, putting out fires, meeting deadlines, just trying to keep up.
Oh, absolutely. It's like you're constantly in this reactive mode.
Exactly. And when you're in that mode, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture, where you're ultimately headed and what you're really working towards.
And that's where having that long-term vision can be so powerful, right? It's like having that compass to guide you, to make sure you're not just drifting along, but actually moving in a direction that aligns with your goals and values.
Yeah, it's like with the sawmill owner. Initially, his vision was all about practicality.
Right, creating a more stable income stream for his logging business.
Exactly. But as his business grew, his vision evolved too. He started thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave, the impact he wanted to have on his family and community.
And that shift in perspective, that expansion of his vision, it ultimately led him to make some pretty big changes in his role, right?
Oh, for sure. Moving from that hands-on operator role to more of a management position, that's a huge transition.
It is. But it was all driven by that long-term vision.
And it really highlights how important it is to be flexible, to be willing to adapt as our circumstances change.
Totally. Because our goals and priorities might shift over time, and that's okay. What matters is that we're constantly checking in with ourselves, making sure our actions are still aligned with our overall vision.
And that brings to mind that veteran logger, the one who was wrestling with whether or not to take on that really challenging job.
Oh, yeah, the one with the big potential payoff, but also huge demands on his time and energy.
Exactly. And I think that's a decision a lot of us face at some point in our careers. Do you go for the quick win, or do you hold out for something that truly aligns with your long-term aspirations?
And that's where having that clear vision can be so helpful, right? Because it gives you a framework for making those tough decisions. It helps you weigh the pros and cons, not just in the short term, but in the context of your larger goals.
Okay, well, we've explored a lot of really insightful connections today, and I hope our listeners are walking away with some valuable takeaways. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this one final thought. What is one small step you can take today to bring more honesty, patience, courage, or self-respect into your own life?
Because remember, personal growth is a journey. It's not about making these huge, sweeping changes overnight. It's about those small, consistent actions that, over time, can lead to big transformations.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on the FBS podcast. We'll be back next time with more insights and strategies to help you navigate the challenges and triumphs of your career. Until then, keep those long-term visions in mind and keep striving to become the best versions of yourself.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.